Do you feel that Europe is able to pursue its own uh, political agenda in any shape or form? If, for example, let's say more right parties come to power, for example, if, let's say, AfD, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, comes to power, or is this simply going to be Europe following the path that's defined for it by the United States of America from now on?
You see, I used to think, like until quite recently, that the trends in Europe are that the Eurosceptics are on the rise, that Alternative for Germany and Marine Le Pen's party in France and others are taking over. They're winning. But I begin to doubt that the European bureaucracy would allow them to do that. It seems to me that more and more indications are that the European Brussels bureaucracy, Führer von der Leyen, is on the course of centralization, of federalization. They continue talking about depriving nation states of their independent veto power. And always the same arguments come. Europe will become more strong. Europe will be more integrated. Blah blah blah. Speak with one voice, and so that seems to me that that is the trend. They would not allow AfD to win. In France, it's very easy to manipulate elections because you have essentially in France three segments. You have the centrists, which is Macron, and then you have the leftists, which is Mélenchon, and then you have the right, which is Marine Le Pen, nationalists. And as soon as one of the three, wins the first round, the other two can gang up and stop him. And this is what happened last elections. And this is very easy. That's the way the French system is designed, unless there is a real outrage, which is possible because France is in bad shape. Changing governments, and Macron is only there because he cannot be ousted until 27. So the trends, if the trends of democratic structures continued, then Europe is moving away from the centralist, Russia-phobic stance. That would be the development would be towards Europe as a common market rather than a common bureaucracy. In other words, they will still have common market. They would still have trade with various partners in a multi-central world, but there wouldn't be any kind of a veto power of any one country or group of countries. But that's only if they allow trends to develop, they develop. If they ban AfD, if they maneuver French elections in a year to an outcome that would be Macronism without Macron, then nothing will change. And the last comment on Europe, it seems to me that one cannot ignore the fact that Europeans are aware of it, that there's no such thing as one Europe. There's Northern Europe and there's Southern Europe. And the Northern Europe is extremely anti-Russian. It's Britain and Denmark and Finland and Poland and the Baltic countries, including Germany. They're just ardent to fight the Russians and get destroyed in the process. And then there's the Southern Europe and Central Europe, which is Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Austria, Greece, Italy, and to some extent Spain, that are definitely not in any way or shape or form eager for any confrontation for Russia. They are the ones who are just kind of nodding silently, but in fact, if you ask them, they would rather that there be no conflict, and if possible, there's trade and normal relations. So who knows what trend would prevail? The Southern Europeans with the skeptics in the north, or the North Europeans with a kind of a federalization and tightening controls. We shall see.
I really appreciate you pointing out the differences in Europe because I think here in the United States, we typically refer to Europe as a whole, right? We don't really distinguish between various national interests of the countries that comprise the EU and Europe more broadly. But in fact, the EU and Europe, it's a very fractured entity in terms of its interests, culture, social realities, economically as well. So it does appear that the project of the European Union or the project of the European Union is to consolidate power in Brussels at the expense of national interests and at the expense of the differences that that nations enjoy historically that they would like to have and would like to maintain. For example, Hungary is an excellent example of it, where not only did PM Orban took a stance against immigration policies of the EU, but also he's very much against the sort of foreign policy direction that the EU has assumed and really doesn't want to change. Now, I believe today, for the first time in Munich, both Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, and French President Macron brought up the topic of European nuclear deterrence in their speeches. And so that was quite shocking because given that the START treaty between the United States and Russia expired last week, and that was a very important agreement in terms of arms control and nuclear arms controls. So now we're hearing European leaders start discussing nuclear deterrence. So doesn't this indicate that the EU is now quite uncertain about the reliability of the United States nuclear umbrella? Or what is your view on Macron's and Mertz's comments with regards to nuclear deterrence capabilities for their
Yes.
countries?
Yes, I think it's just posturing, and especially Macron, because Macron wants to be the leader of Europe. This is the role that he would prefer. And the only way where they could be superior to Germany is in nuclear field. Everybody knows that the French economy is way behind the German ones, and the German one is collapsing, and the French is collapsing too, but not as fast. And German factories are closing down, but at a slower rate, perhaps, than the just because they're not in the industrial power. French exports is agriculture and articles of fashion and wine and cheese and all that sort of thing. But anyway, about the nuclear issue is that they certainly want to project that France is a nuclear power and the only one in the European Union, and it could expand its umbrella. All that is just empty talk because specialists tell us that the French nuclear forces are minuscule. Now, of course, any nuclear bomb, can kill a lot of people, and so whether they're minuscule or not is not may seem like it's not so relevant. On the other hand, what matters is the delivery, is the satellites, is the guidance systems, is all kinds of things that go with it. So if you have a nuclear bomb from the 1950s, it would never make it to a target in modern times because you have to have delivery system that could be intercepted, and it could be before it would fly any far away from France, it could be exploded over France. In other words, the French are so far behind the United States and Russia in nuclear field that I don't think it's possible within 10, 15 years ever to catch up. And you have to have lots of money to do that. This is not done quickly. This is not the stuff. If you kind of are behind, what are the chances you will catch up? It's virtually impossible because there's always new stuff coming up all the time. So in terms of nuclear, the strongest country in the world is Russia. It has more nuclear weapons. It has hypersonic missiles that Americans have been trying very hard to deliver, but they haven't yet. So France is just laughable. When the Russians generals hear this, they think, okay, well, let's let them try. It's just nowhere close. But even that is not as important. What the Merz and Macron don't want to talk about is that I cannot imagine French officers serving under German officers and the other way around. The historical scars are deep and profound. I cannot imagine Polish officers taking orders from German officers. In other words, the dreams of a European army are just dreams. It cannot be done. The only thing that is conceivable is that you have, Polish units and German units, and they're all supposedly European army. Each has its own command, and each has its own tasks that are given by the Poles to the Poles, by the Germans to the Germans, but not by the Germans to the Poles or to the French. So that's the problem. That when Macron talks about European army, he says, oh, one of his speeches was that the Finns could come up with 200,000 and the Poles with 200,000 and the uh, Turks with 200,000. That's like La Grande Armée, 600,000. And then Napoleon or Macron would lead them in battle against wicked Russia. This is just daydreaming because it's not going to happen because it's impossible. And even if it were possible, Russian generals do actually, have plans in case of a big war in Europe to take care to confront 800,000 army. And then again, I should know, we could talk about it for a long time, but I just mentioned that when when Rutte talked about Russian advance in Ukraine at a snail's pace, what needs to be said in this regard is that it is only a snail's pace because the Russian army doesn't want to hurt the civilians because these are citizens of Russia. Everybody who lives in Donbass is a Russian citizen by definition because it's a part of the Russian Federation. So they're very, very careful. Even when they hit Kiev, yes, it's cold and yes, it's difficult, it's miserable. But at the same time, if you look at the casualty figures, it's like 2 killed, 3 killed, terrible bombardment. Russia has hit with 500 drones. And then look at the casualty figures, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, if it were NATO, it wouldn't be 2, 3, or 5. It would be
Yes.
200,000, 300,000, 400,000.
I was just going
Without
to
even,
Yep,
yeah.
I was
So
just
that's
going
the
to
point.
comment on that. Yes, because I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what brings
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what
No,
what, what
go
you
ahead.
just reminded me is Yugoslavia, right? And not um, NATO's military campaign there, if I can call it that, or the shock and awe. So this is a completely different approach to a military conflict, and somehow the West has the nerve to sort of make it seem as though Russia can't unleash the same thing that they did to the civilian populations of those countries, whereas Russia is approaching it, as you mentioned, in a completely different manner.
Yes, like when the Russians bombed these electrical stations and power stations and even industrial facilities, uh, like in Kharkov, some plants, they're doing it at night. They're doing it to minimize civilian casualties, even of those workers who are there. Now, one could actually do it the other way around. If you wanted to maximize the number of casualties, you could do it during the daytime. You could actually have it without any warning. The Russians have completely, I mean, they haven't bombed Kiev. Uh, for months. All these foreign delegations come there all the time, and they're not afraid because they know that that's really not their target. Their target is the infrastructure and foreign detachments. Those they have been trying to hit very hard, especially if there are known bases of foreign soldiers fighting in Ukraine. Then they hit those as fast as they can.